11,000 people, 9 islands. The highest natural ground in the entire country sits lower than the roof of a 2-story house. Stand in the middle of the capital and you can see the ocean on your left and the ocean on your right at the very same time, because the strip of land under your feet is barely 700 meters wide. The airport runway doubles as the town square. And all of it, every shoreline, every road, every coconut palm, is running out of time. So this country did something no nation in history has ever done. Before the ocean takes the islands, Tuvalu made a copy of itself. You probably think this is a story about an island drowning. It isn't. Tuvalu is not sitting still, waiting to disappear. Tuvalu is trying to work out something far stranger, whether a country can keep existing after its country is gone, whether you can lose your land and still keep your nation. And the answer that 11,000 people are about to hand the rest of the world is going to matter for far more than 11,000 people. Over the next several minutes, 3 things are going to stop making sense. First, the way Tuvalu is dying is not the way you think. These islands are not simply slipping under the waves. Second, the digital copy they built is not a museum and it is not nostalgia. It is a weapon and it is pointed at the rest of the world. And third, the part that should sit uncomfortably with you, more than 9 out of every 10 Tuvaluans have already signed up to leave. And that may not be the end of the country. It may be the plan. Tuvalu sits in the middle of the Pacific, roughly halfway between Hawaii and Australia, far enough from everywhere that almost no one ever goes. No tour buses, no cruise ships. To get there at all, you take one of the few flights a week, and as the plane drops in, people clear the runway, because that runway is also where the town gathers in the evening to sit and talk and play. 9 islands, built up over thousands of years on the rims of ancient, drowned volcanoes, rings of coral and sand, resting on top of the sea rather than rising out of it. Add it all together and you get about 10 square miles of dry land. The average height above the water is a little over 2 meters. Most people live below that line. There is no high ground to climb to. There is no inland. On an atoll, the inland is the lagoon. And this is where the story you've been told begins to come apart. Because everyone describes Tuvalu the same way, a place slowly sliding beneath a rising sea, the water creeping over the land inch by inch, until one morning the islands are simply gone. It's a clean image. It's easy to picture. And it's wrong. Some of Tuvalu's islands have actually grown. Researchers tracking the coastlines across decades found that storms and currents pile fresh sediment onto the reefs, and several of the atolls gained land area even as the ocean rose around them. So if the islands aren't shrinking, why is the country running out of time? Because the ocean isn't coming for Tuvalu from the side. It's coming from underneath. An atoll is porous. It sits on coral, and seawater moves up through that coral the way water climbs through a sponge. As the sea rises, salt is pushed up into the very ground the islands are made of. It seeps into the wells until the water people pull up to drink tastes of salt and can't be used. It rises into the pits, where Tuvaluans grow pulaka, a starchy root crop, the staple that fed these islands for centuries, and the plants rot from the roots upward. The land can stay above the waves and still lose the ability to keep anyone alive. Tuvalu will not drown all at once. It will become unlivable first and disappear later. Subscribe to Impossible Lands, because what this one small country did next is now being studied by governments far larger than itself, and by the end of this, you'll understand why dozens of nations are watching Tuvalu like they're looking into a mirror. Hold that slow version of the threat, the salt rising silently through the ground next to the fast version, because the slow death has a violent twin. In 2015, a cyclone named Pam swept through the Pacific. Tuvalu was nowhere near the center of it. The storm wasn't even aiming at the country. It didn't need to. The waves it threw at the islands rose 4 to 5 meters taller than the islands themselves. Picture that for a moment. Water standing higher than the only land you have, walking across it, tearing homes off their footings and dragging the soil out into the lagoon. A storm that wasn't even pointed at Tuvalu wrecked a large share of it in a single night. And it doesn't take a cyclone. On an ordinary day, under a clear sky, the highest tides of the year now do something that simply didn't happen before. The water doesn't roll in over the beach. It comes up through the floor. People stand in their own living rooms and watch the sea bubble up between the coral and the concrete, rising out of the ground beneath their feet, filling the house from below, and then sinking away hours later as if nothing had happened. That is what it feels like to live on land, The ocean has already worked its way underneath. So you would expect a country this small and this remote, with almost no exports and barely any tourists, to be one of the poorest places on Earth. By most measures, it is. But Tuvalu owns one asset worth a small fortune, and almost no one outside the country realizes it's theirs. Back in the 1990s, as the world was dividing up the internet, every country was handed a two-letter code for its web addresses, the way Britain got its own ending, and Germany got theirs. Tuvalu was assigned the letters TV, just an accident of the country's name, except those two letters also happened to be the worldwide shorthand for television. And as the internet became the place where the whole planet watches video, an address ending in TV turned into something companies would pay enormous sums to use. Today, streaming firms pay Tuvalu millions of dollars a year for the rights to that address. The live streaming giant Twitch, watched by tens of millions of people every day, runs on Tuvalu's national domain. A real slice of the entire government budget comes from leasing out two letters of the alphabet. And here is the part worth holding on to. When that money first started flowing, Tuvalu used some of it to pay the fee to join the United Nations. A country the sea is now trying to erase bought its seat among the nations of the world with an internet address. Remember that seat, because it's about to become the single most important thing Tuvalu owns. By 2021, the people running Tuvalu had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was merciless. The world's promises to cut emissions were not moving fast enough to save a country whose ceiling is a few meters of sand. So Tuvalu stopped asking to be rescued and started preparing to outlive its own land. It began with an image the entire world saw. At that year's Global Climate Summit, Tuvalu's foreign minister, Simon Kofe, recorded his address to world leaders. He stood at a wooden lectern, in a dark suit and tie, with his trouser legs rolled up to the knee, standing in the sea. The water moved around his shins as he spoke. He was delivering a warning about rising oceans from inside the rising ocean, on a patch of water that had recently been dry land. A year later, at the next summit, he released a second video. This one opened with Kofi standing on a calm, sunlit Tuvaluan beach, palms behind him, the lagoon glittering in the light. And then, as he kept speaking, the camera slowly pulled back and the beach broke apart into pixels. The sand, the trees, the water, none of it was real. He was standing inside a computer-built copy of his own country, and that was the announcement. Tuvalu would become the world's first digital nation. Now, when most people hear the words digital nation, they picture a memorial, a beautiful, sorrowful archive. Somewhere your grandchildren might one day put on a headset and walk the streets of a country that no longer exists. And Tuvalu is building exactly that. Teams have gone island to island with laser scanners, capturing every one of them in 3 dimensions, every curve of the coast, every reef, the records, the language, the songs. But if you think the point of the copy is to remember, you've missed what is actually happening here. The digital twin is not a museum, it's a legal argument. Here is the logic behind it. Under international law, a state is generally expected to have a territory and a permanent population. Take away the habitable land, and Tuvalu's rivals, or simply the passage of time, could argue that it has stopped being a country at all. And no territory means no state. No state means no government, no seat at the United Nations, and, most importantly, no claim to the ocean surrounding it. So Tuvalu moved first. It rewrote its own constitution to declare that its statehood and its borders are permanent, that they continue, in the country's own words, no matter what the rising sea does to the land. And it began assembling a precise, permanent, 3-dimensional record of its territory to stand behind that claim. The scan is not there to make anyone feel something. It is there to serve as evidence proof that the territory still exists, even when there is no longer anywhere to stand on it. And the reason that claim is worth fighting so hard for has almost nothing to do with the sand. It's the water. A country's borders don't stop at the beach. They reach out across the surrounding sea into what's called an exclusive economic zone. Tuvalu's dry land comes to about 10 square miles. The stretch of ocean it controls runs to hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, many times larger than the country itself, and home to some of the richest tuna waters on Earth. That ocean is, by a wide margin, the most valuable thing Tuvalu has. If its statehood vanishes the instant its land becomes unlivable, all of that sea turns into open water, and the fishing fleets of much larger nations move straight in. So the fight to stay a country, even one with no habitable ground left, is also a fight to keep that enormous stretch of ocean from being swallowed by someone else. None of this means Tuvalu has surrendered the actual islands. With outside help, crews have been dredging sand up from the lagoon and pumping it ashore to build new, raised land ground engineered to sit high enough to stay dry against the tides expected for the rest of this century. They are, quite literally, manufacturing a few extra meters of country, one pump at a time. But everyone involved understands the math. You can lift a patch of the capital. You cannot raise an entire nation of low coral atolls fast enough to outrun the sea. The reclaimed land buys time. The digital nation is the plan for when the time runs out. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable number in this entire story. In 2023, Tuvalu signed a treaty with Australia. On paper, it's a partnership. Australia agreed to help defend Tuvalu and to come to its aid in a disaster. But the part that matters here is this. The treaty opened a path for Tuvaluans to move to Australia and build permanent new lives there. Only a fixed number may go each year, 280 people, drawn by ballot. In 2025, when the first ballot opened, more than 90% of Tuvalu's entire population applied to leave. Sit with that for a moment. 9 out of every 10 people in a country raising their hands to go. It sounds like the end. It sounds like a nation quietly giving up and walking out the door. But hold it up against everything you now know, and it turns into something else entirely. Because Tuvalu has spent years making certain that when its people scatter across the world, the country itself does not dissolve with them. The Constitution says the state is permanent. The digital territory keeps the borders fixed in place. The seat at the United Nations stays filled. So Tuvalu may be on its way to becoming the first nation in history that is real, recognized, and fully sovereign, while almost none of its citizens actually live inside it. A country governed from a homeland that is underwater. The exodus isn't the collapse of the plan. The exodus is the plan. But every plan has a price, and Tuvalu's is hidden inside a question its own people keep asking. What actually survives the upload? You can scan a coastline. You can record a language, photograph a meeting house, save a map down to the last centimeter. But a culture is not a file. Take the fatale, a Tuvaluan dance, performed by rows of people seated on woven mats, clapping and singing together, faster and faster, until the wooden floor of the hall drums and shudders beneath them. You can film it, but the footage can't carry the heat of the bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, or the way the floor shakes up through your legs, or the fact that the people clapping beside you are your neighbors on the island where your grandparents are buried. Half of what that dance is can never be stored on a server. And that is the quiet danger running underneath all the engineering. A people scattered across Australia and New Zealand and beyond, holding onto their nation through a constitution, a digital map, and a seat in a glass tower in New York. They may keep the country. But the country slowly becomes something you log into, rather than somewhere you live. The graves stay behind. The reef stays behind. The small, ordinary accidents of growing up in one exact place, the smell of the lagoon at low tide, the sound of a particular wind through the same palms, none of that uploads. Tuvalu is betting that a nation can survive as an idea. What it cannot promise is that the idea will still smell like home. And here is the part that turns a strange story about 11,000 people into something that should genuinely unsettle you, because Tuvalu is not the exception, it's the preview. Tuvalu is simply first in line. Behind it, on the very same rising water, sit Kiribati and the Marshall Islands' neighbors whose high ground is just as low, whose people are watching Tuvalu's experiment closely, because they are going to need it next. Beyond them, the Maldives. And beyond all of them, strung along every low-lying coast on the planet, hundreds of millions of people who assume the way you probably assume that a country is a permanent thing. A fixed shape on a map that will always be there. Tuvalu is quietly proving that it might not be. That land can leave, and a nation can refuse to leave with it. That the map you trust is not a guarantee. It's only the current draft. Tuvalu is becoming the first nation that can lose its land and keep its country. So the question is no longer whether its islands will go under. The real question is, the one Tuvalu is now forcing the rest of us to face. If a country is not its land, then what is it? And how many more times is the world going to have to find out? That question is exactly what this channel exists for. If you want to keep standing at the edge of the places where the world stops making sense, subscribe to Impossible Lands and turn on notifications. The map was never as permanent as you were taught, and this is where we go to the places proving it.